Our research examines the change in unemployment rates from the 1920s to present time. Questions that guide our research include what general factors have influenced unemployment rates? What influence has domestic society, such as social movements and etc., had on unemployment rates? How have government actions and decisions, excluding the executive branch, impacted employment rates? Which historical events caused the percentage of unemployment to either skyrocket or plummet? And when were the employment rates the highest and lowest? What has unemployment looked like in different ethnic groups and backgrounds over the last century? Is there a trend? These are the questions that guided our research. Unemployment rates are extremely relevant as we are in the midst of a global pandemic. It is important we learn about them because they give insight into the state of the economy and economic welfare of its citizens. By examining employment rates, we can learn the trends within various periods and apply that information to improve the current economy. Our first source gives the data table of the year, unemployment rate, and notable events which contributed to each yearly rate. Additionally, it discusses how unemployment can correlate with business cycles, layoffs, and spending cuts. Our second source breaks down the rates of unemployment in different ethnic, gender, and age groups. For example, younger workers tend to have higher unemployment, while middle-aged workers tend to have lower unemployment, probably because the middle-aged workers feel the responsibility of needing a job more heavily. The unemployment rate for women had historically tended to be higher than the unemployment rate for men, reflecting the historical pattern that women were seen as secondary earners. However, by about 1980, the unemployment rate for women was essentially the same as that for men. The unemployment rate for African Americans is substantially higher than the rate for other racial or ethnic groups, which reflects to some extent the pattern of discrimination that had constrained their labor market opportunities. However, the gaps between unemployment rates for whites and for Black and Hispanic people diminished in the 1990s. Our third source builds off the second and delves deeper into the discrepancies of unemployment in different ethnic groups. It suggests how factors such as education and geography can have an effect on the disparity in unemployment rates for minorities. Our fourth source covers fiscal policy, which is one way the government can control economic recessions. When a country slips into recession, the government works with the Federal Reserve to reduce unemployment by boosting economic growth. The main method used is expansionary monetary policy. The article explains how, during an expansionary policy, the Federal Reserve eases monetary policy by reducing the federal funds rate and buying U.S. Treasury and mortgage-backed securities on the open market, which increases the supply of money in the economy. This is done to lower interest rates, which encourages businesses to borrow money to buy capital equipment and hire more workers. Low interest rates also tend to boost the housing market, spur auto sales, and increase personal spending. Our last source explains how domestic society and social movements affect unemployment rates. It discussed the unfinished March on Washington and how there was significantly more unemployment in Black communities as a result of segregation before the Discrimination and Employment Act was passed. Here we can get a concrete example of a social movement which worked to fight the issue of unemployment, more specifically, fair employment. Here we have a data table and a graph which displays the change in unemployment rate from 1920 to 2020. The graph shows how the unemployment rate skyrocketed from 4.2% in 1920 to 18% in 1930, which is over 4 times the previous amount. As seen in the table, the events that contributed to the rapid increase during this time included the market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression, which lasted till 1933. The unemployment rate then fell back down to 5% due to actions such as the passing of the New Deal, the Employment Act, and the Fair Deal. From here, the unemployment rate continued its regular fluctuations with the market.
So instead of focusing on a more generous period of time, we tune into 1925 to 1932. And our new question is, what would unemployment rates look like yearly from 1925 to 1933 during the heat of the Great Depression? So if you're looking at these first three problems, you can see a trend where the average rate of change is increasing substantially as time goes on. So I'm just going to break down one of these to explain the math. So we used the normal slope equation, which was y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1, and in this case we just used f of x because it was more representative of this project. And again, f of 3 correlates to 1927, where the unemployment rate was 3.2, and F of 1 correlates to 1925 when the unemployment rate was 2.4, and we plugged our points in and we solved and we ended up getting around 0.4. So that's how the math worked for these problems. So these findings express how quickly unemployment can increase when the economy is weak or when the market crashes. This is important because in relation to the world, America has a very strong government and we are usually able to control our economy. However, this data shows that in 1925 to 1932, and more specifically in 1929, the government really struggled to compensate for the market crash. My point here is that other countries around the world might not be as fortunate as us without government agencies to control the market. So the Great Depression should stand as an example to the world that a strong central government is needed, or else unemployment rates can become an exponential problem. So now for our exponential equation, it is important to consider the base we used for this, which was f of x is equal to a times b to the x, where a is that initial value and b is the growth factor. So for this, I picked 2 points, and instead of sticking with that first point for the a value, we decided to use that second and these 2 points because that first point is a little bit of an outlier. So it made more sense not to stick with that first point. So basically what we did was we plugged them both into the base equation and we set them equal to each other. And after plugging these points in and setting them equal, we solved for b and we got 1.3867, and then we were able to plug that again into the equation, and we plugged in the first point as well with that and solved to get 1.6121 times 1.867 to the x value. And just as a reminder, that 1.3867 is basically saying that it's exponentially increasing with the growth factor of 38.67%. So now I'm going to move into our instantaneous rate of change problems. And again, instantaneous rate of change is the rate of change for a moment before or after a given time period or point. So first we're going to look at the second bullet point. In the year of 1931, the unemployment rate stood at 15.9%. I calculated the time or moment right before this year as shown in the point 6.999. I plugged that number into the function and solved for the y value and got 15.89. Once I solved the problem completely, I got the rate of change at the moment of year 6.999 and got that it was around 10 percentage points per year for unemployment. This makes sense as the graph begins to grow more exponentially, so the instantaneous rate of change before the seventh or second to the last point should be much larger than the others. Additionally, this was in the heat of the Great Depression and is historically representative of the given time. The next point we're going to look at is the fourth bullet point. I went through the same process and took the point 0.999, which is representative of the time right before 1925. I did the same math by plugging this point into the function and then using that answer in the slope equation. In the end, my answer came out to be 1. This is again representative of the given year of 1925, as the economy was stable and unemployment rates were low. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to move on to my analysis here. So these findings are important because they express the vigor of an unstable market when it is not controlled at any given moment of time or an instant before a given year. The rate of change for unemployment rates can increase substantially when the market is low. The world around us can learn from this research by understanding that there needs to be a sense of urgency once the economy hits a rough patch. Instead of fixing itself, the economy worsens, and without the help of a government, a once flourishing nation could ultimately lead itself into its ultimate demise. And that was kind of stark, but that's the best way to word it. So now for our future predictions, and how we solve these problems was we just plugged in the year into our x value and into our x value of our equation, of our exponential equation. And what you can see here is that with each of these, the number is greater than 100, meaning that 100% of the population would be unemployed by 20, 50, or 100 years. And why this is important is because let's just say that we're in 1932, that would mean that in less than 20 years, 100% of the population would be unemployed. And if our government didn't take care or didn't take control of the market, that would probably really affect our country and our stability. It definitely would affect our stability. So now I'm going to move into this next slide. So when would the size double, when would the size triple? So for this, what we did was we doubled that last point in 1932 when the unemployment rate was 23.6%. And if it doubles, it's 47.2%, and triples, it is 70.8%. And what we did was we plugged those numbers into our exponential equation for the f of x value. And for the first point, if it doubles, I got that it would take around 11 years, 10.329 rounded up. And for the other, if it was tripled, it would take about 12 years, which is 11.569 rounded up. So obviously we're not in 1933, or 1932. However, let's pretend that we are for the sake of this question. For the math, I proved that it will take 11 years for the unemployment rate to reach 42.7%, which is basically half of the population. Even more crazy, it would take around 12 years to hit 70.8% unemployment. Though 11 to 12 years seem far ahead and are not very threatening, and seems to not be very, very threatening, one would need to consider the people affected in this time to truly understand the situation. If the population now is around 126 million, and by now I mean 1932, that would mean that in 1944, around 59 million people would be unemployed, and then in 1945, around 89 million people would be jobless. In the future, people would have to work harder than ever before to undo the slack that was created by the Great Depression. There is even the possibility that America would not be able to come back as prosperous as it was before in 1925, for example. So it's important to understand that in our true present time in 2021, our nation probably wouldn't be stable and we would not have a thriving economy. And in the end, I don't even think America would be a country because we wouldn't be able to support ourselves. So overall, we assessed what unemployment rates looked like from 1925 to 1932, leading into the heat of the Great Depression. The most significant mathematical idea found during this segmented period of time was that the rate of change was around 38.67% per year, which is huge considering it expresses the percent of people who would become jobless. Because of this rate, the data following express unemployment rates through the roof. What I mean by this, for example, is that if the unemployment rate were to continue at this rate, it would only take between 11 and 20 years for there to be 100% of the population unemployed. Crazy, right? Fortunately, we know that this is untrue and that we have monetary departments like the Federal Reserve, which keep the market stable. Upon our reflection, comparing the research from Part 1 to our findings in Part 2, it is relieving to see that unemployment really is not exponential. The original graph in Part 1, based around the data we gathered from sources, shows how unemployment rates are unpredictable and that they commonly fluctuate depending on the stability of the economy. In conclusion, by looking into the Great Depression unemployment rates exponentially, we can see what our economy and the rate of unemployment might have looked like if we were not to have the fortune of a strong central government and experts who really truly understand our economy. And that wraps it up. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry that was a mouthful, but that is it for our presentation. Quickly, I'm just going to add that whenever I said 1933, I was referring to 1932 as our data does not include 1933.